Hello my friends, welcome back to another video. Happy Father's Day, June 18th, 2023. Okay, so today I'm going to review a very fun article. Actually, it's a chapter from a book called Millennial Cervantes, New Currents in Cervantes Studies, edited by Bruce R. Birmingham from 2020, put out by the University of Nebraska Press. So this chapter, Chapter 2 of the book by Rosalie Hernandez. Chapter 2, Dios me entiende y no digo más. Nominalism, Humanism, and Modernity in Don Quixote. So the first, the two most important words in this title, nominalism and Don Quixote. Okay, so what's nominalism? Well, Rosalie Hernandez does an excellent job, I've got to tell you, in explaining everything you need to know about nominalism and about what the aspects of Don Quixote, the philosophy of the time, and what it says about the work Don Quixote, but also what Don Quixote says about the philosophy. So, just as a quick upfront, I don't completely agree with the author and her thesis, but nevertheless I found this to be a very fun read, very enjoyable, very informative. Sometimes there's an article you come by that just does a great job in reminding you of some important things that sort of you have stored there in the memory, but not in a very systematic way. That's the thing, sometimes articles are great, or in this case chapter in a book is great because it explains to you or reminds you of things that you had forgotten about, at least in a really clear fashion, brings them to mind and presents them in a way that's quite informative and sort of gets you thinking again and connecting dots between different things. But that said, this, in my opinion, this is something I was thinking of as I was reading it. In my opinion, this is a case of intellectuals putting too much stock in philosophy, the relevance of philosophy for whatever it is. Say if you're examining War and Peace and thinking about Rousseau's influence on Tolstoy. Yeah, Rousseau was very important to Tolstoy, but doesn't mean that Rousseau was all that influential in War and Peace or whatever, or overemphasizing his importance, that you say, okay, well, Rousseau played a role in the crafting of War and Peace, but not nearly as importantly as Tolstoy's aunt did, or a book he read in grade 3 did, or a casual conversation he had with a neighbor, So, to my mind, Hernandez wants to wrap up things in too neat a package, in a sense, but nevertheless, it's really good that she shows some of the philosophical currents of the time. Okay, so what's nominalism? Nominalism is so let's take Platonism. Platonism is realism in the ultimate sense of the word. So Plato says that universal forms exist outside of human empirical perception, function as abstract ideal objects or paradigms independent of our mental processes. This is what she writes on page 2 of the article. But, I mean, what she says basically is that our ideas of any general concept like goodness, justice, whiteness, tallness, clarity, whatever, these are real things. These general concepts are real things. And in fact, Plato said that they're the most real things. And so Christians were always sort of comfortable with that and saying that the ideals are in God's mind and they are the things out of which God constructs the universe. Now, Plato said that they're not in God, and in fact, in a way, the forms are sort of greater than God. Well, it depends on how you read Plato, but it doesn't really matter one way or the other. Now, a sort of a middle position between Plato and nominalism is Aristotle's definition. And she writes that in Aristotle, in Aristotelian formulations, universals are equally real, but they are instead formed from and depend on the characteristics that can be generalized from our perception of particulars. Okay, so that kind of makes sense, that more towards the Lockean persuasion, that if that we don't that generalizations aren't real, the universals aren't real, and we never encounter them, but that they have a role in helping us understand the world, right? So that Aristotle would say sort of a semi-realism, in the sense that he'd say that, yeah, they're absolutely real things, and we can say what justice really is, or whiteness really is, or what elephantness really is. And that's how Aristotle approached all these things. He was looking at he was trying to discover the reality of things. Think about species. And today in biology, species aren't real things, right? Species can change. One species can become extinct, and a species can evolve into another species over time, blah, blah, blah. Well, Aristotle didn't know that, didn't think that. Whiteness was whiteness, elephantness was elephantness, right? But they don't exist outside of the particulars, whereas Plato said, yes, they do exist outside of the particulars, the instances of those things. Okay, nominalism. Nominalism dates back to the 14th century with Occam. Now, Occam is best known for the logical principle associated with him, Occam's razor, right? Occam's razor basically says, take the simplest explanation, don't multiply entities, right? So if you can explain something in a simple way, then explain it in a simple way. Okay, so whatever that is, like if a package showed up at your door overnight, don't say that, there's these entities called angels, and the angels brought the package there from God, blah, blah, blah. Say, oh, well, there's a postman or something. See, that's the simpler explanation, right? Okay, so let's get a good definition of nominalism here. So on page 4 of the article, the author actually quotes Occam as saying, no particular substance is a universal. Every substance is numerically one and a particular. Okay, so think about that for a few minutes. There's no universals. That's more like, I suppose, Locke, in a sense that everything is experiential. And in the absolute furthest, this move away from universals would be existentialism and postmodernism, where there are no universals, and universals are simply subjective creations of a person or set of experiences, and that they have no reality and no significance beyond the individual's experience and defining of those things, right? So nominalism means nameism, right? So you put a name on a thing. There's no such thing as red. And if you look at my definition of red, my experience of red, and contrast that with another person's, you'd see that I include some oranges that they don't include in that definition of red, and they include some yellows that I don't include in that definition of red, okay? And green and blue is another great example. How many arguments have you gotten into with somebody saying that that's green? No, that's blue. So that would be the world according to Occam, in a sense. Now, this doesn't mean that Occam is an atheist, okay? And so why am I making a connection between nominalism, realism, and atheism? Well, Occam doesn't, because Occam does the ultimate Muslim thing, or the ultimate Protestant thing, and he says that the most important thing about God is not truth or goodness, it is will. So God is free in the furthest sense of the word, that he can create as he chooses, he can change what he chooses, he can even contradict himself if he wants to, he can change anything. And so think about that. Like, if you have absolute principles like goodness, justice, kindness, mercy, then in some way these things put limitations on God, right? That God has to be merciful, and that he can't just say, well, today merciful means this, tomorrow it means the exact opposite. Occam says that's completely permissible, whereas Aquinas, Plato, Augustine would say that that's nonsense, and you're looking at it the wrong way. So they would say that God creates things, the world and all that stuff, logic, truth, goodness, because it is what he is, and that goodness means of God's nature, and it is good, it is perfect, and that the world has a real relationship to absolute principles, so that real goodness is in the world, real redness is in the world, real tallness is in the world, and obviously most importantly, truth, comprehension of the truth, like true knowledge, that these are real things, that these don't follow from God's will, but they follow from God's nature. Okay, so God creates according to his nature. His nature is perfect. Of course, he would will his nature to be perfect because he is perfect, right? So there's two ways of looking at things. It's the old stupid thing that, can God create an object so heavy that he couldn't lift it, right? It's just two ways of looking at that real paradox, right? So it's really interesting. The author points out that since God is, or according to Occam, since God is ultimately free and can contradict himself, can choose to call good evil and evil good, up, down, mercy into hate, or whatever, that how do we know that he wills our salvation and continues to will our salvation or our good or whatever? Occam says that becomes an object of hope, not an object of absolute belief or conviction. That we hope that God will continue to be good as we understand goodness, but he's not obliged to be good or to continue on in the manner in which he has, right? And so she also points out at one point that Occam said that God could have incarnated himself into a rock or a tree or anything in terms of his incarnation in Christ and the salvation he gained for us, for human beings, through the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, that he could have chosen to incarnate himself into a rock or a tree or anything, right? That he wasn't bound by anything. Okay, so what does any of this have to do with Don Quixote? All right, so the thing going for her argument is that yes, these were new popular ideas in the time of Cervantes' early 17th century, late 16th century Spain. Yeah, okay. These were as popular in his day as, say, I don't know, postmodernism or Nietzsche or Marx or whatever is to us today, okay? So that's fine, but it doesn't prove that Don Quixote was influenced by that way of thinking. Now, her argument runs as follows, that I don't know what that Spanish means in the title, Dios mío, Entiende, Digo más. I don't know what it means, but it definitely has something to do with emphasizing God's will, drawing me through my life, or something like that. So if we know about the story of Don Quixote, that Don Quixote is a man who very much willed the world around him, sort of willed into existence the world around him. I mean, we could call him mad. We could call him, as we'd say in a positive light today, that he was very imaginative, very creative, had a strong imagination, like we would say with a child with an imaginary friend or something. That Don Quixote created a fantasy of himself and of the world, and that this reflects Occam's prioritization of will over nature, right, in that sense? So that it wasn't important that Don Quixote's ideas didn't cohere with the ideas of those around him, but that the importance he placed on will and imagination were. So if I quote here page 8 of the article, it says, the humanist nominalist conception of the will proposes a vision for the individual who is heartened to create himself, not strictly tied to a predestined station and given identity, but rather as an artist or a free agent. What Stephen Greenblatt has defined as self-fashioning, and of which much as has been said in relation to Don Quixote. The author Hernandez wants to underlie the fact that Cervantes wants to talk about the importance of, or not the importance, but of the reality that we create our narrative for ourselves in that sense, and that Don Quixote is a great example of how the will creates the world we want to live in, right? I don't know about that, because when you think about, yes, it's, Don Quixote is such an interesting character because we don't know what category to fit him in. He's comic and tragic. He's insane and he's virtuous, right? So that's the whole attractiveness about the story, is we don't know what to make of him, that he is able to reach across these categories. Like, is he a tragic character? I mean, his ending seems tragic, but we're left with such an affection for him, and we feel that him giving up the Don Quixote fantasy, the knight-errant fantasy, is itself tragic, so that his madness is the good thing, and overcoming the madness is the tragedy. So there's something to be said about that Don Quixote waking from his fantasy is actually the tragedy. And the book says literally that the opposite is the case, that waking from the delusion is a good thing. But we feel that when Don Quixote burns most of his books of the adventures of all the knights, that there's a tragedy and a loss in this. So is the tragedy that we become less like God when we cease to have our will dominate our destiny, but that we conform ourselves to a preordained destiny or a preordained script in that case? The question is, okay, yes, all these things are interesting interpretations of Don Quixote and of Cervantes' point in creating the story, but was he trying to say these things? Was he trying to make any connection at all between the anomalist conception of God and Don Quixote? Or was the tragedy, insofar as there is tragedy in this story, simply a result of the fact that he deviated from, let's call it, the Thomistic conception of God? So Thomas Aquinas is sort of in terms of metaphysics, is sort of a mixture of Platonism and Aristotelianism. But in a certain sense, every Christian has to be a Platonist to a certain extent, because the pure concepts, the absolutes, the forms of things are absolute, right? They're not matters of interpretation, that there is such a thing as goodness per se, whiteness, of truth, of understanding, of kindness, of justice, right? These things are absolute. They're not subject to interpretation. They are absolute and able to have absolute definitions, right? They're not just conventions in that sense. That something more than people saying that, well, truth and goodness is great, but truth and goodness are only experienced as effects of someone's personal, the summation of one's understanding and experience of truth and goodness and whiteness, injustice, and all those things, right? That you'll never find a person whose definition or experience of these things is not other than his experience of those things. So his definition is his experience, and his experience is his definition, right? I want to start talking about Kant at this time, but That would be too much. We don't need to do that. Yeah, that in a certain sense, Kant provides more plausible or more attractive notions of the forms in a certain sense, and he says that they're not forms, but these are categories of understanding, right? They're not precisely the same, but in a way they function the same way in terms of our apprehension of the truth. So the question is, let's go back. Is Don Quixote influenced or arguing for an Occam nominalist view of God and of morality? I don't think so. I think that those are fascinating concepts. I don't think it's enough to say that Cervantes couldn't have written Don Quixote the way he did unless there was an Occam. Now, that's possibly true. So what you're saying is that Don Quixote could not have been written before the time in which it was written, because before that time, all thought was dominated by a Thomistic conception or a Platonic / Aristotelian conception of truth. I don't know what to tell you about that. Yes, there are absolute distinctions between Dante's Divine Comedy, which is absolutely Thomistic, in the prioricity of these categories or forms or whatever you want to call them, and that Don Quixote, the novel itself, is a far more existential or subjective view of the world. But on the other hand, I can't help but think of how fluid the conceptions are when we talk about stuff like, let's take the Arthurian romances, the chanson geste, the tales of chivalry, like whether it's the quest for the Holy Grail, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Lancelot and Guinevere, whatever, that despite the fact that we have a culture dominated by Thomistic realism or Platonic Aristotelianism, that it really doesn't matter because there is so much magic in that medieval world that defies the kind of absolute control of categories that someone like Hernandez would say is the implication of Thomism, so that whether you're in a world dominated by Thomism or a world that has experienced nominalism, the fact is that these things leave so much room for the subjective experiences and creativity of the storyteller. I don't know, but nevertheless, not agreeing with Hernandez writing this article, I give this article like a 9.5 or 9.9 out of 10. It was just so interesting and informative that I definitely would urge you to read it if you can. And I'll put it up on my Patreon page for as long as I can legally do that or whatever. And I hope you will read it. If you don't understand it after having read it, that's great. Read it a second time, or listen to my discussion a second time. Now, my last video, I did talk a little bit about the difference between essence and existence when I was talking about group loyalties and Aquinas's view of kinship. And I said essence precedes existence, which is the opposite of existentialism, which is based upon the idea that existence precedes essence, that you get to choose your world in a certain sense. Now, Aquinas, he wouldn't have to say that essence precedes existence, because coming from a Platonic view where the forms are absolute and the ultimate categories of existence are the forms, are the absolute categories of truth, then existence and what you get to do with your life and how you want to live is limited by possibility. Whereas existentialism says you're only limited if you believe you're limited. So don't believe you're limited, right? We can see how popular an idea that is today, isn't it? That you can be whatever you believe you can be. But having said that, I seem to be arguing against Hernandez in this article. I seem to be saying the opposite of what I said in my video on Aquinas' group loyalties, but I'm not. I'm not saying the opposite. What I'm saying is that the forms, according to Thomism and Platonic Aristotelianism, the forms are flexible enough in that we can still have adventure, creativity, artistic expression, and that the forms are the building blocks out of which we build these things, out of which we can construct a beautiful world, whether that's the world of Dante or the world of Don Quixote. So I suppose that's as good a place as any to stop. I hope you have a great day. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. I know I have. And I hope you read the article or the chapter. Okay, guys, thanks so much and have a great day.